Great. Thank you, Brad. So a couple of things. This is certainly real. And when we brought up this topic with the executives, the HR executives who are part of our master's program, this was a very lively topic because the experience was so common. Just some of the stories that we've heard, which may resonate with some of you, an urban emergency room dealing with the workforce's reaction after the police shootings this summer, trying to balance the demands of the workforce to advocate on behalf of the community with the very critical relationship that emergency room has with the local police. We heard from a hotel saying basically employees did not want to work at a particular political event, so they canceled the event, only to get a huge backlash from other employees who challenged that they were not a political organization. Why did it happen? We had another example where a gay producer did not want to work on developing content for a company that was overtly anti-LGBT. Other examples, how will a company react when things affect their bottom line? And I recently heard the CEO of American Airlines talking about two incidents that they dealt with. One was, would they or wouldn't they speak out on voting rights, and deciding to make that statement, but then a couple months later facing backlash from their employees after restoring political contributions after the January 6th suspension of those contributions. And then, of course, there were some ones that are really, as Brad mentioned, employee to employee, where people were going to local school board meetings, having huge arguments there, and having that carry back into the workforce the next day on Slack and in the break room and in other ways. So, does it really matter? Does this stuff stick? If you look at the sociologists and some of the research we looked at, senses of differences between teams, of course, tend to undermine trust. They do modify behavior and team performance, and we've seen resignations coming out of these disputes. Whereas on the other side, similarities do reinforce job satisfaction. They're a huge employee value proposition where people feel they belong. The other thing that I thought was interesting from some of the sociology is that where there's stress around other topics, people then become reluctant to engage even in business discussions that are difficult, that have nothing to do with those outside issues. So in looking at how this is happening, one of the things people are looking at in companies is, well, why is this happening? It really goes back to people's innate need to belong and connect. And that sense of belonging and connecting is only made more important to people when they're experiencing isolation and anxiety. Then they really want to feel that sense of belonging. And during the pandemic, the things that are normal, the cues that tell people things that are normal, like being in the office every day, riding the train, going into restaurants, those were gone. And all that's heightened, and it's heightened at work, the differences at work as well. And the other thing is many of the filters are off. People are feeling less need to be politically correct on things. And as a tipping point has happened on a couple of issues, people are not stewing alone on something they observe. They're kind of shouting together, including at work. And of course, the battle over misinformation of all kinds on all sides only fuels this. So it's really come down to a couple of things that help us address those issues that companies are undertaking. There's sort of 6 actions here. One is providing very strong, renewed messaging on the company position and values. So we see people doubling down on that because that begins to establish a group level goal, a group level sense of membership that will transcend some of the local and more subgroup memberships in there. And the other thing that dialogue is undertaking is to what's called cross-cutting, which is to say we have more in common than we have differences. And so the way that's happening is Southwest Airlines, for example, promoting things like civility and kindness as a cultural value and really pushing that. Kaiser Permanente started pushing the culture of us so that the people begin to look out for each other and begin to overtly think of that as a group that they want to be part of. I've also heard a lot of companies are now doubling down on a stream of information that's relevant to their business needs so that it begins to provide context for decisions they might make, but it also helps counter some information that may be overbalanced in a direction that's not helpful to them and is important. Another technique for that doubling down is this interesting Sesame Workshops leader during the pandemic wrote a weekly note to employees about what was on his mind, what was he thinking about, again, as a means of providing insight into a perspective and a point of view that they might not otherwise see. And of course, I thought interesting too is how do you provide a new tribe, more common tribes that cut across? And companies are reinvigorating things like volunteerism committees in their group, hobbies and other social groups that again provide a different set of boundaries. The second thing that was interesting, I think, from our executive group was to step back and say, what skills do our leaders not have that are required in this new climate? And it really came back to, are people skilled at having conversations? Can they really, do they go into a discussion or a meeting just trying to force their point of view? Are they skilled at bringing fact-based dialogue, listening, and really exploring through context, understanding context of where someone's coming from, asking questions, and also, of course, facilitative leadership. With all the time pressure and hurry and the sense of the Zoom meeting, things tend to get a little bit maybe too expedited. So they're teaching facilitative dialogue and listening. There's also teaching dispute resolution and de-escalation skills. When you think about it, most managers never are formally trained in de-escalating, but that may be most important, that first 30 seconds of a conversation and how to be effective. I also saw some interesting things on manager skills from an MIT study that talked about being more task-oriented when a group is difficult, rather than being more team-building oriented. It was a bit counterintuitive, but the theory is, in a social setting, a team building setting, people will go on what they already know and gravitate to people they already know. In a task-oriented environment where the manager focuses on everyone's contributions, they begin to recognize each other's skills and values beyond just belief systems that they may assume. The other thing, the third technique that we see, and this I think is interesting and challenging, is setting up these forums for dialogue. Brad mentioned this, these safe spaces where people can actually take on some of these political or social issues that are laying underneath of all the daily work and talk about them. The real success factor there has been to have facilitators, to make them very much voluntary for people who are interested in participating. And of course, setting up a lot of ground rules that people commit to in order to participate in the conversation. For example, being vulnerable themselves to considering that maybe their position isn't the only position or the right position, and to make space for new ideas, things like taking winning off the table. So these are carefully cultivated dialogues. There's General Motors is doing this, Target, General Mills has a Courageous Conversations program, and that's very interesting. And Allstate has a Better Arguments program that they're running with the Aspen Institute. Again, trying to build trust, empathy, and skills, frankly, because those skills and those will translate back, hopefully, into day-to-day behaviors. The fourth area is really engaging carefully on social issues. And it's interesting, the Gartner study recently showed that 87% of employees feel businesses should take a position. And even when they're not directly related to their business, they were 11 times more likely to respond positively if that position reflected values that they understood. But they were 6 times more likely to be negative if they thought the message was hollow and didn't have any actions associated with it. So this also becomes a very landmine potentially, but potentially a very powerful way to engage with your workforce by taking that position. The fifth area we heard about was really taking a good look at workforce standards and enforcement in light of this whole new climate. So Brad mentioned political talk and clothing, use of company resources. How will you deal with employee actions that are reported to you that take place outside the workplace? Do you have a policy? And also customer standards. What will you enforce about customer behavior when they're interacting with your workforce? We see it in a retail setting, but other students have reported to us settings in industrial settings, delivery docks, everything else. And finally, of course, the sixth area is testing the impact of this tension on internal processes. We've seen increased reports of real, and who knows if it's real, but perceived impact based on political beliefs or social beliefs or alignments, and also feeling that shun or cancel culture that may be going on in your climate. So other companies are starting to think about that. How do we test that? How do we make sure that this is not creeping in to our shared processes?